All right. Welcome everyone to Audubon Society of Central Arkansas's monthly meeting. I'm Dan Scheinman, the Vice President of ASCA. And our guest speaker tonight is Dr. J.D. Gantz. J.D. grew up in northeastern Ohio. After graduating from Mount Union College, he joined the Laboratory of Ecophysiology, Cryobiology at Miami University in Ohio to study how insects survive a variety of environmental stresses, with a particular focus on chilling, freezing, and dehydration. The Antarctic Midge, Belgica antarctica, was among his primary study subjects, which gave him a chance to travel to the Antarctic Peninsula to collect and study these remarkably stress-tolerant animals. After earning his PhD in 2018, he started as an assistant professor of physiology in the Department of Biology and Health Sciences at Hendrix College, and he continues to research the physiology of invertebrates that live in polar regions and other extreme environments, and to collaborate with many amazing students while working in Antarctica and Alaska. And tonight he'll share with us about how one goes about conducting research in extreme environments like Antarctica. So take it away, JD.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. People who know me or even just have to listen to me sometimes will readily attest to the fact that I'm very enthusiastic about sharing some of my experiences. So this is just a great outlet for it. I'm so excited. I've been involved with the Audubon Society before when I was living in Ohio. It's a wonderful society, and I'm just really happy to be a part of this. So as Dan said, my name is J.D. Gantz. I'm a professor at Hendrix College. I've been living in Arkansas for 3 years now, having finished my PhD. And I guess I'm here to talk a little bit about what entomology in Antarctica looks like. I promise you now, this is not going to be a science talk. There's no data in here at all. You don't have to interpret any graphs or figures. We're just going to talk about what life is like working in these sorts of places, the reasons that I'm there, why I think this work is important, and so on. I don't want this to feel like super formal. If anyone has questions along the way, feel free to interject or hold them toward the end, either way. But like I said, I'm just happy to share this stuff. So whatever works for everyone, I'm happy with. Okay, so just to start out, the insect that you see in the center of this screen, that is the larva of the Antarctic Midge, Belgica antarctica, that I have been so fortunate to get to study. And you'll hear a little bit more about them later on in this talk. So I guess with that, we'll just get started. And I never thought I'd be saying this. In fact, not that long ago, I never would have even thought it was possible that I'd be in entomology. The idea of it was pretty foreign, and I didn't grow up with any maybe special love for insects or anything like that. But through my career in entomology, I have had what I think are some pretty remarkable experiences. So entomology has made it possible for me to take 4 separate research trips to Antarctica. My longest trip lasted 5 months. My most recent trip took place in the spring of 2020, which was a bit of an adventure because we were traveling back from the Antarctic Peninsula as things were shutting down from COVID. So I was in Patagonia when, in Chilean Patagonia, when Chile declared martial law and was shutting down all their airports. And questions about whether we were going to be able to get back, or for a while there was talk about forcing our ship to stay offshore for an undetermined amount of time. There was just a lot of chaos going on at that point. It was a weird time to be coming back to, society. In all of my trips together, I've spent about a total of 1 year on the continent of Antarctica, and I am hoping, we're making arrangements right now for another trip in the spring of 2022. Would be about a 5-week research cruise traveling along the length of the Antarctic Peninsula to study some more bugs. And also, since I've started at Hendrix here, I've had the chance to develop some of my own research programs that now are including a project studying insects in Alaska. So I took a trip with some Hendrix students to Fairbanks, Alaska in the summer of 2019, collecting a bunch of insects associated with a new agricultural industry there, which happens to be peony farming. We won't talk about that much today, but another kind of cool, fun thing that I've had the chance to do. And I now have funding to take students to Alaska for each of the next 3 years, starting with this summer. So I'm in the process of recruiting some students to go along with me there right now. And I'm just very excited for that trip as well. Oh, and then also, yeah, I have this goal to turn that into a long-term project where I will get to continue studying insect populations and how they change over time in central Alaska. I'm kind of angling to make it a career-long sort of endeavor because Alaska is amazing too. And I'm just fortunate to have the in here. So I'd like to make that last as long as I can. So, as I said, entomology has just been good to me. I grew up in rural northern Ohio, and had you asked me a few years ago whether I thought there was any chance I'd have the range of experiences I've had, the answer would absolutely be no. So I think it makes sense then to talk just a little bit about how I came into some of these opportunities, how I got to the place that I am. And I just want to start out by acknowledging my privilege a little bit, in that even though I have had some tension with family going into science and everything, I still grew up in a family that expected me to go to college. Getting an education was a thing that I knew I was expected to do from some of my earliest memories, really. My family also really encouraged my inquisitiveness, and just additionally, I have never encountered any roadblocks in my life due to my race, my gender, my sexuality, that sort of thing that a lot of other people have to overcome. So I do have quite a bit of privilege that has helped me along the way here. And as I mentioned before, I grew up in rural northeastern Ohio. My family had a very adversarial relationship with science. We were, yeah, maybe there were a lot of things that we rejected that are kind of widely accepted by science. And I went into any interaction with scientists in scientific fields, largely rejecting the very premise of it. And part of that was also not only my family, but the area I grew up in had some similar views. I attended a school district where many of my science teachers were skeptics about evolution, climate change, conservation efforts, and anything like that. So I ended up graduating high school believing that I disliked science, that I actively disliked it, and spent my first year and a half in college avoiding any science classes because I was convinced that I just didn't like it. It wasn't a thing I was interested in. And I ended up attending the local small liberal arts college because I was able to be a commuter student, which saved me a little bit of money. And while there, I met and worked with two just remarkable professors who really laid a foundation for changing my life. Here on the left, we have Dr. Brandon Schaefer, and on the right, Dr. Charles McClarity, both in the biology department there. And when I finally did start taking science classes, because at a liberal arts college, you kind of have to, I fell in love with the subject pretty quickly because, in part because of these professors, and I think they certainly had to give me a little bit of extra patience, perhaps, as I took my time toward figuring things out and becoming a little more receptive to science in general. And then even with the help of these professors, I didn't really think that I wanted a career in science until I took a class called Physiological Ecology in my junior year. And just briefly, Physiological Ecology is a branch of science that looks at the physiology of animals, or what's happening internally that allows them to survive. It helps keep their metabolism going, helps them maintain balance in body temperature and hydration and all of that. And then how their physiological adaptations allow them to fit into their ecological niche. So it's this kind of big picture, holistic view of physiology that within just a couple of weeks of that class, I just, nope, this is what I want to do with my life. All other plans that I have out the window. I want to be a physiological ecologist. It just made the world make sense to me in a way that I'd never really experienced before. So I switched to a biology major. I began working in doing a little bit of research with one of those professors, Dr. Schaefer, and began looking for graduate programs. And so at this point in my life, I was able to step back and recognize that some really remarkable professors changed my life in a pretty profound way. And so as I was thinking about graduate programs that I wanted to pursue, I thought that I would also like to be in a position where I can provide a high quality education to other people and hopefully have as positive of an influence on other people as some remarkable people had on me. So from the very beginning of even thinking about graduate school, I knew that teaching was a thing that I really wanted to be a big part of my life. And Hendrix has been wonderful about that. It's just an excellent school with great students and real focus on teaching that makes me happy, and it's a pleasure to work here. So I ended up going to graduate school at Miami University, the one in Ohio, not the one in Florida, so Southwest Ohio near Cincinnati. And I ended up joining this lab called the Laboratory for Eco-Physiological Cryobiology, and worked with this man at the bottom here, Dr. Richard Lee, who was just about the best advisor I could have ever hoped for. He encouraged me to not only find success in my research, but also to spend time working to become a good teacher and distribute my time in a way that allowed me to develop some of the skills that made me qualified to hold a job at Hendrix afterwards. So that was a really just great working relationship. And it didn't hurt that a lot of his research was focused on polar entomology, specifically with the only insect that lives in Antarctica. So during my 6 years in graduate school, going after my PhD, I developed these research projects that are all related to stress tolerance in ectotherms, or cold-blooded animals. And by stress tolerance, I'm talking about things like dehydration, low oxygen availability, UV irradiation, changes in pH, high temperature, low temperature, and so on. Basically, any number of things that insects can face in the wild that are going to result in some sort of physiological response. And through all of this, I was working with insects most of the time. And through all of this, I just developed this profound love for insects. I've mentioned it earlier, I didn't have a particular interest in insects prior to this point in my life. In fact, I naively thought briefly about turning down this opportunity in this lab because I didn't really want to work with insects, or I at least wasn't excited about working with insects. I had my eye on a different project working with frogs. And I am, in retrospect, so grateful that I made the decision that I did, because I've developed this profound love for insects. They're fascinating. And that might have to be a different talk, because I could go on about just insects in general, not specific to polar entomology, probably more than anyone wants to hear. And so through my PhD program, I had a chance to work with a variety of insect models, including houseflies, goldenrod gallflies, woolly bear caterpillars, migratory locusts, and Antarctic midges. And really the star of the show this evening is going to be the Antarctic midge. So to help kind of understand, well, to help kind of shift the focus, I suppose, toward the Antarctic midge, let's start talking about that. We'll start talking about what it takes to just get to Antarctica to study this bug. By the way, I'm calling it the Antarctic midge. It is a species of fly, a wingless fly. It is the only insect native to Antarctica. There are some cases where we have some non-native insects that are starting to invade further and further south. So there have now been a couple of other species of insects that found living in Antarctica. We're not sure if they're viable populations or just ended up there during the summer and would die during the winter. But since they're coming down from places like Patagonia and some of the subantarctic islands, we know that they're pretty well suited to tolerate cold temperatures, and it's entirely possible that they're establishing populations there. Anyway, so traveling to Antarctica it takes a little while. It's not an easy place to get to. So we fly from the United States. I usually flew from Ohio at the time to Denver, or sorry, not to Denver, to Dallas. So from Dallas to Santiago, Chile. Then from Santiago, Chile, there's another 4-hour flight down to a town of Punta Uranus, Chile. And then from there, we would take a boat or a ship across about a 4-day crossing to get to Palmer Station, which is the northernmost of the United States Antarctic Program's research stations on the Antarctic Peninsula, all 3 of which are shown on this map. But Palmer Station is the only one that the insects live at, and is much warmer and more permissive to animal life in general than the others. So it's the only one that really makes sense for me to go spend any time at. Okay, so flying into Punta Uranus here. Punta Uranus is the largest city in the world of the southernmost city of 100,000 or more people. So they're very much the southern tip of South America. And we flew in there after about 24 hours or so of travel, would arrive in Punta Uranus. We'd get on a ship and follow this yellow route through the Straits of Magellan out into the Atlantic Ocean, and then sail along the coast for about a day to get out to the open ocean south of the southern tip of South America. This is the ship that we use to travel. It's a 225-foot icebreaker contracted by the National Science Foundation. It's called the Lawrence M. Gould. And, it's one of those that it's endearing because it's not perfect. It has some issues that makes everybody fall in love with it. It's very slow. It rides in the water weirdly, which makes some people seasick, more so than they normally would be. And those people who get extra seasick on this ship will defend it so much more vocally than other people. Like, people just fall in love with this slow, weird ship. And I don't really know why, but I also love it. It's just some of the best moments in my life have been on the ship, and it's great. So as we board the ship, we're traveling through the Straits of Magellan. We can start watching for animals. And it is in the Straits of Magellan here that I saw my first penguins ever. These are called Magellanic penguins, and they have a variety of colonies through the islands and other land masses around the southern tip of South America. And then we also start to see some of the seabirds in this area. Here we have a black-browed albatross, which is the most common species of albatross that we'll see on any of these trips. The black-browed albatross is also called the black-browed mollymock. And I'm just calling that out because mollymock is one of my favorite names of animals ever. I don't know, it's delightful. So the black-browed mollymock, as far as albatrosses go, they're kind of on the small side. They have a wingspan of only pushing 8 feet, which is still bigger than my wingspan. But, as far as albatrosses go, it's a little bit wimpy. They can live to be up to 70 years old, so they're one of the longer-lived albatross species. And right now, their population size is pretty good. According to IUCN, there are about 1.4 million individuals in this global population. But they are a species of concern right now because they are also the most common species of bird killed by longline fishing practices. And with a long-lived bird that is facing some other ecological challenges, to have large numbers of their population removed by something like longline fishing is starting to concern some people. Okay, so once we get out of the Straits of Magellan and down past the southern tip of South America, we end up in open water in what's called the Drake Passage. And the Drake Passage is just a special place. It is the only place on the planet that you can circumnavigate the globe at a given latitude and not run into land anywhere. So that means there's no natural wave break. And the result is the Drake Passage is known for having some of the roughest seas in the world. I have crossed this on a slow, weird boat 8 times now, and about 4 of the times I had some delightfully smooth, like almost surprisingly smooth crossings. And on the other 4 crossings or so, we've had a little bit of rough weather. This is not the worst I've seen, but I'm maybe 50 feet above the surface of the water here in maybe 25-foot waves that lasted for about 2 days. And so I've seen up to 40 to 45-foot waves. And it gets bad enough that in your bunk, if you want to go take a nap, you have to stuff clothing or something like that underneath one side of your mattress. So your mattress is angled, pinning you against the wall so that when you hit a wave, you don't get tossed out of your bunk. And you certainly struggle with eating, or you can never put your food down or drink down or anything like that, because it's going to end up all over the place. So you just kind of figure it out for a while. People hang out, take a lot of seasickness medication that makes people drowsy. So we hang out and watch movies or whatever, and just try to survive the couple of days in open water. But I'm one of those fortunate people who has not had much of an issue with seasickness on these crossings, which has given me a chance to look for seabirds. And I just want to briefly highlight one of my favorite seabirds out there. This is a wandering albatross in its juvenile plumage. So it doesn't have the really stark white wings that a lot of people look for in wandering albatrosses, but it's the best look I've ever gotten at one. And I love wandering albatrosses. They're incredible birds, and I'm going to spend a couple of minutes here telling you why. So wandering albatrosses are really the world's ultimate soaring bird. They have the longest wingspan of any living bird, up to 12 feet in some of the largest recorded individuals. They can live more than 50 years, and in their life will probably fly more than 1.5 million miles. In any single year, they have tracked individuals who have just circumnavigated the globe more than 3 times, covering more than 75,000 miles. Also, after fledging, they can spend up to 6 years never touching dry ground, just on the wing, hunting constantly. They don't come back to dry ground until time to start nesting. So once they reach sexual maturity and find a partner and lay eggs. So as they're soaring, they often sustain airspeeds of 50 miles per hour or more. And their flight is remarkably low cost. As people have started looking into this, it turns out that they, depending on the weather conditions, will spend somewhere between 1% and 14% of their time while flying actually having to flap their wings, which means that up to 99% of the time, they don't have to flap at all. And a handful of physiologists decided to start studying this and found that they can fly for days at a time with absolutely zero mechanical costs of flight. It costs them exactly as many calories to fly as it would for them to be sitting on the surface of the water bobbing around. So that, of course, generated a bunch of questions about how this is possible, how this bird manages this. And it turns out there are 3 main factors that contribute to this. Number 1 is they have a locking mechanism in their shoulders that helps, once they hold their wings aloft, it kind of locks them into place with the way their bones fit together, so that they don't have to use any muscle activity to hold their wings out. They're just, they're locked in place. Then they will often use air currents forced upward from waves. So if you're in a place that has 20 or 30 foot waves, if you're flying along close to the surface of the water, as you get this upwelling from a wave, the wind has to follow that same pathway, and they can use these updrafts, the air forced upward from the waves, to gain altitude then, and not have to create any of that force on their own. But then even more importantly, they use a strategy called dynamic soaring that I'll show you a graphic here in just a moment for what that looks like. But basically it's using the constant wind that they have, that they can kind of rely on in this area around the Drake Passage, where they'll build up a little bit of momentum and then turn into the wind. And as they turn into the wind, they just angle upward slightly, so allow the wind in their face to propel them upward as they lose momentum. Then as they reach kind of the pinnacle and their momentum is waning, they turn to fly along with the wind, gaining momentum, reaching speeds of 80 plus miles per hour as they drop down to sea level again and just turn back and forth. So they fly in this kind of lazy S pattern until they find something at the surface of the water that they want to eat. And at which point they might actually have to put some effort into flying. But otherwise, it's just based on their flight pattern and this S shape that they can fly in that gives them the opportunity to fly with almost no energy. So just a little bit more about wandering albatrosses. I promise we won't spend the rest of the talk on them. They right now are listed as vulnerable. They have this decreasing population. So the total numbers worldwide are estimated somewhere around 20,000. Most of the deaths of wandering albatrosses are a result of the longline fishing industry as well. So this is a problem for a wide variety of seabirds. And there are a lot of ongoing conservation efforts for them. And with just 20,000 individuals, it's a species people are really watching. Okay, so once we get out of the Drake Passage, we come up along the Antarctic Peninsula, and the island that Palmer Station, the station I do work on, is highlighted in red. It's called Anvers Island. We have about a day worth of sailing once we get alongside the peninsula until we actually get to Palmer Station. And it is just gorgeous. I am fully convinced there is no more beautiful place on the planet than the Antarctic Peninsula. We have these coastal mountains rising straight up out of the ocean, glaciers coming down to the water level. It's breathtaking. I love it so much. And I will tell anyone and everyone who gives me the opportunity, it's breathtaking. It's just this super dramatic landscape. And in addition, the wildlife is remarkable. We'll talk about some of that in a moment. I don't want to derail myself too much. So once we actually get to Palmer Station, this is what you'll see. It's a small collection of blue buildings that are built right at the edge of the water. The glacier sits right behind Palmer Station, so there's really not much exposed land there. The station only holds 44 people at the maximum, so it's a pretty small spot. By comparison, the largest US research station in Antarctica is McMurdo Station, which has a capacity of nearly 1,800 people. So this is a much smaller place, and it is mostly a place where people who want to study Antarctic wildlife go, because again, this is pretty far north in Antarctica and is where it's a little more permissive of an environment for animals to live in. So if you go in the front door at Palmer Station, this is one of the first things you'll see. This is our galley and our kitchen. It's really just well-appointed, nice, comfortable space. People who work there will often work for 5 or 6 months at a time. The Antarctic program recognizes how isolating it can feel to be there for that long of a time, that far away from family. So they go out of their way to make it comfortable. One of the ways they do that is they always get really good chefs to cook for us. So we have 2 full-time chefs providing just wonderful food. Some of the best meals I've ever had have come in Antarctica. And between the food and the comfort of the place, it really helps build a pretty tight-knit community. We also have some places set aside for like health and wellness, as well as recreation. So here's a small but reasonably well-appointed gym. You can go in here and use free weights and any number of machines and whatnot, which is really great as well. Then as far as more on the entertainment side of things, we have this lounge where every day after the workday ends for the contractors who have like a set 8 to 5:30 work schedule, someone hosts a movie, or they'll come up here and play video games on the projection screen or something like that. And again, just kind of build some community there. And then adjacent to the lounge, we have a bar, because, you know, especially if the weather's bad and, you know, people are looking for things to do, you can go grab a drink in Antarctica. And the nice thing is we don't have to worry about making ice. It's just readily available outside anytime you want. And just go get some glacier ice for your drink. But if the weather's nice, a lot of people really enjoy spending time outside. And this is, for me, really part of what makes Antarctica incredible is you just get to go hiking around on a glacier for recreation anytime you want. Certainly I recommend it more when the weather's nice than when it's not, because it can get pretty gnarly out there. But from that last photo, I was up on the glacier looking back at Palmer Station. This is turning around 180 degrees, looking the other direction. This is Mount William, which I think is one of the most photogenic mountains that has ever existed. And if you walk along this glacier a little bit more, you get this view of the bay with coastal mountains and glaciers. And again, just, I love this place so much. It's an incredible. Now, the weather in Antarctica is not always good. So you can't always go hiking around on the glacier and looking at the mountains. So we have to come up with things to do to entertain ourselves when the weather's bad. People get a little creative with that. We had a giant ping pong tournament where, at the time anyway, I could say I was the second best ping pong player in at least that region of Antarctica. We had someone who turned 30 years old and they wanted a Harry Potter themed birthday party. So we threw a Harry Potter themed birthday party complete with a sorting ceremony. I apparently am a Hufflepuff. And just, you know, had a blast with that sort of thing. Every time someone has a birthday or some major event, life event happens, we polar plunge in celebration. The water is minus 1.8 degrees Celsius. So it's constantly slightly below freezing. So as you plunge, you pretty quickly run to the hot tub afterwards to warm up. Yeah, it makes for a really good time. And, you know, being able to plunge for your friends when something big happens also just really helps build that sense of community that is really important when you're that far away from home for that long, and especially over holidays and birthdays and things like that. Okay, so thinking a little bit more about working in Antarctica now, it turns out that that little spit of land that Palmer Station exists on is not, there's not a whole lot biologically going on there. People moved in and the animals that might have been there at the time kind of moved away, but fortunately not very far. So we use these little rubber zodiacs that you can see two of my friends on here to boat around to some of the surrounding islands to find our animals. And so we have this kind of 2-mile radius around Palmer Station that we can pretty freely travel in these zodiacs to get to our research sites. And this area is just replete with wildlife. So you never know when you're going to have a penguin or a whale come check you out, or have some seal encounters or whatever it may be. Occasionally the weather gets a little bit gnarly when we're out boating around. We've had some pretty heavy fog roll in and had to wait out some storms and stuff out in the field to avoid boating through conditions that are just a little bit much for my 10-foot rubber raft. So this was trying to get home on one particularly rough day when a storm rolled in unexpectedly. We made it, obviously, but it took some time and patience, and everyone was just soaked afterwards. Once we get to the islands that I start looking for insects on, one of the first things that struck me about this part of Antarctica, it was surprisingly lush, surprisingly green. So I'm going to use that as a segue into talking about the flora that we can commonly see in Antarctica. This first picture is of a terrestrial alga called Prassiola crispa, and it grows in large mats along kind of low-lying areas of dry ground. And it happens to be a favorite food source for my insect. So when I see that, I often know to go look there for bugs. We also have a pearlwort, two species actually of pearlworts, a couple species of hair grasses. Lichens are fairly common around there of a variety of species, but the dominant plant material in the Antarctic Peninsula are mosses. There are 25 or more species of mosses, and they can grow in huge, like almost peat-forming mats along much of the Antarctic Peninsula. So really any place that has been ice-free long enough is probably going to be covered in moss of some kind, at least to some degree. It's surprising if we see a place without moss, frankly. Okay, so switching to animals now, the types of animals that we often see around Palmer Station. We're going to start by focusing on this little guy. This little guy, the Antarctic krill. This one's having a bad day, being eaten by an Antarctic tern. But basically the entirety of the Antarctic food web is based on the nutrients provided by these krill. And because the krill are here in huge numbers, we get a lot of seabirds that hang out and will nest in the area. So everyone loves penguins. We'll start with some penguins here. This is an Adelie penguin with a newly hatched chick and an egg that it is still incubating. Okay. We also have chinstrap penguins, which are traditionally more, at least in a relative sense, more warm water penguins, but they have been slowly moving further and further south. So 50 years or so ago, you wouldn't see many at all around Palmer Station, and they're getting to be fairly common there now. Even more so, we have Gentoo penguins, which are, again, a much warmer water species that is moving further south, so that they're actually becoming the most common species of penguin around Palmer Station. So the places that I am going to study insects there, the islands I'm going to look for insects on, will have thousands of breeding pairs of penguins just everywhere. It's a cacophony of penguin calls and things like that, and just a lovely, lovely experience. So this is an example of one of my field sites that I decided to collect insects from. And as you can see from this photo, it was pretty tough duty having to go back to this spot multiple times looking for insects. I was working at this particular site for a few months by the time I flipped over a single rock, though, and uncovered this, which is a colony of Ixodes uriae, or seabird ticks, that were a little disconcerting to find at this point, especially since to collect my insect, I'm laying on my stomach with a spoon, scooping insects out of the soil. So, I'm laying around in this area adjacent to a penguin colony for months, only to find, that there are ticks all over the place. So a little disconcerting. It doesn't look quite as impressive in this photo, but this particular colony had almost 3,600 individual ticks in different life stages, and there were only maybe 50 or so penguins in that entire colony. So the parasite load on those birds is apparently pretty high. Another one of the animals that makes its presence known in Antarctica is the skua. There are two species of skua down there, the brown skua and the polar skua, South polar skua. They are this kind of obnoxious mix between a seagull and a hawk. And they're lovely, wonderful birds. I love them, but they also do make life tough sometimes because they can be a little bit aggressive. They'll defend their nests, their territories pretty vehemently, to a point where I know some people who have been given concussions by dive bombing skuas. And, you know, I respect the whole, like, hey, my nest is nearby, we have to drive someone off. Like, I get that. But the worst is when you're nowhere near a skua nest and you have one of these angsty teenage skuas that are trying to like practice what it would be like to defend a territory. So anything that moves even close to them, they're going to dive bomb at you. And it can make collecting insects a little bit more entertaining or challenging than it otherwise would be. Skuas also are generalist predators, so they'll eat krill and fish and anything else that they can get a hold of, but their primary source of food, at least during the summer, are penguin chicks. So frequently, if you hang out around the penguin colonies, you'll see skuas trying to swoop in and steal penguin chicks. And not infrequently, they're successful. They time the hatching of their own eggs with the hatching of penguin eggs for this reason, because that's a key part of their diet. Okay, so moving on from birds, there are a lot more birds that I could talk about, but I only have so much time here. So we'll move on to talk about seals for a little while. There are 5 species of seals that live around Palmer Station. This first one is a Weddell seal. They're a very sea ice dependent species. And so they're the least common of the species we see this far north in Antarctica. The second species of seal is an Antarctic fur seal, which they're actually more closely related to sea lions than they are to seals. Back during the days of commercial whaling and sealing, they were hunted nearly to extinction, but have rebounded pretty well lately. And so they're more of a seasonal visitor to Palmer Station, like midsummer on, they start invading the area. We have southern elephant seals that are the world's largest seal species. The bull males can reach 11,000 pounds. They are also one of the deepest diving mammal species in the world, having spent more than 90 minutes in individual dives, reaching more than a mile in depth. There are also these crab eater seals, which, as their name suggests, well, actually don't eat crabs at all because there are no crabs in the Antarctic ecosystem. They are krill specialists. So whoever named that species got it wrong. And then finally, we have these leopard seals. Leopard seals are an apex predator in the area. They can grow up to 14 feet long and will eat pretty much anything. There have been some cases in the last 15 years or so where leopard seals have killed people who are doing research dives and things like that in the area. So anytime we're doing a polar plunge or anything like that, we have to, check the area for leopard seals first. Okay, so I've mentioned that I grew up in Northern Ohio, right? And Ohio is a landlocked place. My family also didn't travel much when I was growing up. So I went, until my first trip to Antarctica, I had never seen a whale. And since I have started going to Antarctica, I figure I've pretty easily seen more than 1,000 whales, 1,000 individual whales. The most common species we see down there are humpback whales, which you see here in this photo. Humpback whales are so common down there that I have a colleague who just calls them trash whales. So like, I still get excited every time I see a whale. I'll call it, oh, there's a whale. And my colleague's like, what kind of whale is it? It's a humpback. Like, don't bother me with those trash whales. Only tell me if it's something interesting. I still call them all out because I'm still very excited about seeing whales. And I don't think that will ever change, but they are pretty frequent visitors to the area. We have also seen orcas in the area a lot, which I recognize they're not actually whales, they're dolphins, but I'm lumping them into this group anyway. So orcas, this next photo is an Antarctic minke whale. It's a small baleen whale, reaching only 30 to 40 feet long as compared to the 60 plus feet that humpbacks can reach. And I also, in one particularly memorable experience, saw a southern right whale, which is a critically endangered species and was the first sighting of a right whale in this area in 33 years. So that was a pretty special experience as well. And just kind of give you a sense of how close you can get to whales in this area, you know, just boating around doing my work, and you can see Palmer Station in the background, and whales will sometimes get curious and come over and check you out. And it's good fun. Okay, so also in this area, we see pretty frequent reminders of the commercial whaling industry and where it was once thriving. So go to any of the beaches there and you're not unlikely to see whale bones scattered about. Here we have 3 vertebrae and a rib bone on one of the beaches. So seeing as many whale bones as I did down there, it got me a little curious about how big the whaling industry was, that it sent people all the way down to Antarctica for this. So commercial whaling had been going on for hundreds of years before any attempt to record numbers of harvested animals began. Record keeping began kind of in earnest around 1900, but even then the numbers are really dodgy because there were lots of incentives for whalers to underreport the numbers of their take. So the numbers that I am about to present here are almost certainly a low-end estimate and are only from 1900 to present, whereas commercial whaling started maybe sometime in the mid-1700s. So it had been going on for a while prior to that. Anyway, since 1900, about 875,000 fin whales have been harvested, 750,000 sperm whales, 375,000 blue whales, 300,000 minkies, 250,000 humpbacks, and numerous other species were harvested in smaller numbers. And as with, we talked about briefly, the albatross, we get long-lived species that have slow generation times. Removing this number of individuals can be devastating to the population. And just for reference, as we see here, about 375,000 blue whales were killed since 1900. The global population is probably somewhere between 10,000 and 25,000, although granted it is whales in general are a type of animal that are difficult to get accurate population numbers. The big take home is that no matter what, the number of whales killed during commercial whaling was huge relative to populations, and their populations are very slowly rebounding since the international commercial whaling ban. So just to finish this super bright topic, here's a photo of a whale skull that I encountered on one of the beaches, and what looks maybe like driftwood or something like that scattered around this beach. Those are all whale bones of some kind or another. There's no wood down there, so that's all whale bone that you see in the background as well. Okay, so you know what? Let's talk about something much happier. So everyone loves talking about bugs, I hope or expect. So transitioning away from whales, we're just briefly talking about entomology in Antarctica. This insect that I study, it's a small wingless fly. It is the Earth's southernmost free-living insect. So by free-living, I mean it's not a louse or something that needs the body heat from a warm-blooded animal. They live on their own. They brave the cold of Antarctica on their own. They're one of just a handful of terrestrial arthropods. So we saw some of the ticks earlier, and there are a couple of mites that live there as well, but these are the only insects. A lot of times when we see animals living in extreme environments, they have to be generalists. They're going to feed on whatever they can and live wherever it is permissible for them to live. And so that's true of this midge as well. And they are what we call a polyextremophile. So extremophiles are animals that love living in, or at least tolerate living in, extreme environments. And the Antarctic environment is so extreme that it presents many different conditions that are really challenging to survive. So many extremes they have to tolerate. It turns out living in Antarctica, at least this part of Antarctica, low temperature isn't the limiting factor. What seems to kill most of the animals that can't survive there is dehydration, because for 9 months out of the year, all the water that would be available to them is locked up as ice. So it's just not available to them biologically, which is more challenging for a lot of animals than low temperature is. And when I say that they're polyextremophiles, I mean that at any given time of the year, just in the normal course of living in Antarctica, these insects can have to face freezing. Even midsummer, we can get temperatures dropping well below freezing at any time. They also, as we just mentioned, have to tolerate dehydration. They can be inundated in meltwater, which is really pure, which creates some osmotic challenges. But then also we get storms that bring pretty robust winds and will blow seawater inland more than 100 meters. So they have to tolerate both seawater, very fresh water, and seawater at any given time. They also live close to seal wallows and penguin colonies and things like that. So they have to deal with the waste products of these vertebrate fauna, like seals and penguins. Being trapped under 6 or 8 feet of ice for much of the year, not a whole lot of oxygen penetrates that ice, so they have to go months at a time with virtually no access to oxygen, and more. There are all sorts of things that they end up having to deal with. And these insects are just so great at tolerating all of it, which is part of why, as a stress physiologist, they were such an interesting study subject for me. Oh, okay, so it is later than I thought. I took longer to go through this than I meant to, so I'll hurry through these last couple of slides. I just want to tout why it's important to be studying insect stress tolerance, because there are a lot of people I've talked to over the years, like, oh yeah, I'm studying bugs and studying how they tolerate like cold or dehydration or whatever. And the response is, why? Who cares? Well, there are lots of reasons why this is important. And first, I like highlighting one of the more unexpected benefits of this work. One of the things that insects have to deal with when they tolerate being frozen for a long time is the same thing that causes freezer burn in food that's held in the freezer for a long time. So that recrystallization of ice that causes freezer burn would kill insects if they're being frozen for a long time. And insects have developed these specialized proteins and sugars that help them prevent that recrystallization. Well, as people from my research group reported on these proteins and sugars that help reduce recrystallization in insects, the ice cream manufacturers of the world like, huh, that's cool, and started making synthetic versions of these proteins and sugars and adding them to food, and are increasing the shelf life of some frozen foods. So who knew? Never would have predicted that, but a cool thing that came from this. Also, there are many opportunities to improve human health. One of the more direct things that we often call out with this is organ preservation. As we've learned about how insects tolerate freezing for a long period of time, we are learning more about how we could actually potentially freeze human organs and tissues and make them viable for a longer period of time until we get the donated organ to the recipient. Additionally, climate change is causing rapidly changing weather patterns and resource distribution. So we're seeing more severe weather. We're seeing more frequent and more severe storms and things like that. We also have changing precipitation patterns. So there's, ongoing droughts and what's called desertification, where deserts around the world are expanding because of these changing precipitation patterns. And this is having an effect on all of the animals that live in those environments. So we're seeing changes in animal populations, including range expansion and contraction, or extinction and invasion events. And, I think often people don't recognize just how important insects are to humanity. So understanding whether certain species of insects are going to expand their range or contract their range if they're a bee or some kind of pollinator is really important. Or if they're a disease-carrying insect like a mosquito, it's really important to understand that ahead of time so that we understand the impacts of some of these changes. And just to illustrate that, here is a map showing projected changes in mosquito habitat just for one species of mosquito, the Aedes aegypti, which is a carrier of a handful of different diseases from 2019 until 2080. So with projections in climate change. So understanding how this is going to change and what effect that's going to have is potentially really, really important for addressing some of these looming health issues. Additionally, a handful of recent studies have indicated that insect populations worldwide are decreasing drastically. There was one study that found a 75% decrease in the total number of flying insects over Europe over a 30-year span, which has been linked to land use, changes in land use, and increased pesticide use. So understanding what's happening to insect species and how some of these climate change effects are influencing different populations is really critical going forward. And then also just working in polar areas, understanding the effects of climate change is really important. The Antarctic Peninsula is warming faster than almost any other part of the planet. The average winter temperatures there, where I was working, are 11 degrees warmer than they were 40 years ago. 90% of the glaciers on the peninsula are receding right now. The entire continent has lost about 3.6 trillion tons of ice. And on average right now, there are 85 fewer days with sea ice than there were 30 years ago. And that is particularly important when you recognize that krill require sea ice to grow, to get out of their larval stages. And so since krill are kind of the keystone base of the entire Antarctic ecosystem, at least animal life in the Antarctic ecosystem, understanding how the reduced sea ice is going to affect krill populations is critical. Because again, lots of animals rely on that, including a variety of species of penguins and seals and whales. And we're seeing some of these effects in real time right now. So Adelie penguins are the more cold weather adapted species of penguin around the Antarctic Peninsula. And in the last 30 years, we've seen a 70% decline in their overall numbers. Chinstrap penguins have also been decreasing, but less drastically than Adelie's. But over that same period of time, we've seen a 700% increase in Gentoo penguin populations, the warmer water adapted penguins. So we get scenes like this where, some years we have this thriving colony of Adelie penguins that just a few years later are completely empty because of some of these changes. Additionally, and very concerningly, I mentioned before, there are no crabs in Antarctica. Well, that might change. There are some cold, deep water species of crabs that live off the Antarctic continental shelf in very deep water. But as you come to water that is less deep up onto the continental shelf, that water around Antarctica actually gets colder. So that cold has been a barrier preventing these crabs from getting onto the shelf and affecting any populations of marine life there. Well, recently, there have been a few deep water surveys that have found that these crabs have started moving their way up the slope onto the Antarctic continental shelf and are invading that area. And this is particularly problematic because the entirety of the Antarctic marine system does not have a single species that has claws, has any ability to crush anything. So there are no hard-shelled animals. The corals are all soft corals. There's nothing here that has adapted to resist the effects of a predator that has claws that can break through softer tissues. Similarly, wow, this is just depressing. I'm sorry. We'll end on a more positive note. But the places that I've worked around Palmer Station specifically, we have seen dramatic effects of receding glaciers. So in 1981, when my PhD advisor was first going to Antarctica, the edge of the glacier was right up against the border of the station itself. In fact, some of the buildings that are there since I have known Palmer Station would not have been possible to build in 1981 because they would have been covered in ice. So just in that amount of time, those 30 years, the glacier has retreated over 1,500 feet. Here's a map that people have been keeping of the glacier edge retreat on this island since 1963, when this spit of land was first surveyed for Palmer Station to be built there. And I have been witness to a number of dramatic calving events where parts of the glacier face break off and fall into the water. And this is, to be fair, this is a thing that normally happens. Glaciers, even the ones that are growing, will have these calving events. But big events like this used to be really rare. People who worked there 30 years ago tell me that we'd see something like this happen every couple of weeks, and we'd see events like this nearly every day working in the harbor around Palmer Station. So I realized that was really depressing. Really, I'm just trying to convince you, or not convince you necessarily, but emphasize how important it is to study these polar areas and the animals that live there and how delicate this ecosystem is and how much it's changing. But I do want to end on a positive note, because I really genuinely believe we can figure this out. First of all, what gives me hope is I have had just the tremendous privilege to work with some of the people who are gathering information about this and who are trying to figure out the answers to help us cohabitate with some of the remarkable natural places and animals on the planet. And those people, I believe in them just wholeheartedly. They're wonderful and incredible people. And if anyone can figure it out, I'm glad they're the ones who are working on it. And then also, humans actually have a history of a lot of really successful environmental policies when international communities work together. And the best example that I have of that is the Montreal Protocol of 1987, where the international community recognized that propellants in aerosol spray cans were causing a growing ozone hole in polar places. And the 180, I forget how many countries, 190 some of the 200 countries, 200 some countries in the world got together and signed a treaty banning these chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, that were causing this hole in the Antarctic, in the ozone layer. And since then, the widening of the hole has ceased. It has started to shrink now, and we're maybe 50 or 60 years away from essentially having no measurable hole in the ozone because of how effective these policies have been. So I think if we can get people working together, really focused on this, I completely believe that we can make really good things happen and can save some of our polar places. So with that, I realize I'm a bit over on time and I apologize for that, but I would happily take any questions that anyone has. Also, this is me trying to be funny. There aren't actually sharks down there. I just used my somewhat poor Photoshop skills to make that photo look even cooler.
Well, thank you, JD, for that. I appreciate it. We'll have time for a few questions. So please say more about ultra pure water.
Yeah. So when water is frozen, the growing ice crystal excludes any solute, anything that is dissolved in the water. So frozen water, like ice, is very pure. You have almost nothing except water in it. And as you get icebergs or glaciers melting, this releases a huge amount of very pure water, which, you know, insects and all animals have a lot of things like ions and sugars dissolved in our body fluids. And having this exposure to very pure water when we have a bunch of stuff dissolved in it can actually cause a lot of stress, including different differences in pressure, osmotic pressure across cell membranes, to a point where many times that can just cause cells to burst. The difference in pressure from very pure water outside of a cell to the normal solutes dissolved inside the fluid, in the fluid inside a cell. So this is a significant physiological challenge that a lot of animals have to deal with, and few are as good at tolerating it as my little insect.
What does a penguin colony smell like, by the way?
Oh, not good. So penguin colonies are about the second worst smell I have ever encountered in my life. The worst smell I've ever encountered in my life are elephant seal colonies.
Oh.
So when you happen to have elephant seals hanging out next to penguin colonies, it's a bit of a double whammy, particularly if you have a at least relatively warm and sunny day. That stuff just kind of bakes, and it's pungent. Yeah, very fishy smelling.
As a reminder, if you want to ask a question of Dr. Gantz, you can type it in the chat box or you can unmute yourself. I'll ask another question then. You showed pictures of the whale bones on the beach. I take it that everything there is protected. You're not allowed to collect the memento.
That is absolutely correct. Yeah, there's no collection of any of that allowed. The environment, the protections against anything like that are pretty strict down there.
Then also about your midge. So the midge is adapted to this cold weather. If you took it to a warm environment, would it survive or thrive? Would it thrive or die?
It would die. That is one of the stresses that they cannot tolerate well at all, is actually warm temperature. So we have permits to bring these insects back to the United States to continue studying when we go to Antarctica. And in getting those permits, we were a little concerned that we were going to have to work really hard to convince regulatory agencies to allow us to bring them back. And the conversation went something like, hey, we want to bring these Antarctic bugs back to the United States. So like, are they a threat for invasion? We respond by saying, nope, they die if it gets above 40 degrees or so. Like, okay, go ahead. So yeah, they can't tolerate warm temperatures at all for any length of time. Yeah, warming temperatures along the peninsula are potentially a problem for this species. Also, you mentioned, clearly they're adapted for cold temperatures. That's obviously true. One thing that I love talking about with these insects a little bit is their closest living relative is a very similar fly, only it has wings in Patagonia. And so we can look at genetically when they split And when they split genetically into two separate species coincides very closely with when Antarctica as a continent broke away from South America. And we think that the reason this is the only insect species there is they started out with the continent and slowly rode it southward to experience these lower temperatures over a very long period of time. And then we're just very good at developing some of the physiological abilities to tolerate those stresses.
And I guess they're flightless because they don't need to fly.
Yeah, so the flightlessness, certainly being able to fly would be a boon if they could pull it off in any sort of useful way, but it is windy enough down there that nothing that small would be able to control its flight, and having wings would drastically increase the odds of you being swept up and carried away to some place you don't want to be as you're just crawling around a rock or in some safe protected place. So it just ends up being a bit of a detriment to have wings, and then also why put energy into building wings if you can kind of survive without. So
tell us a little bit more about how the midges make a living in the environment. What do they eat?
Yeah, great question. So they spend almost their entire lives as larvae, those little wormy things that I showed pictures of twice. And they have a 2-year lifespan. So they'll spend a full 2 years as a larva. And then they pick a warm summer day, get a little bit of sunshine out that prompts the hatching of adults. And so we'll get these swarms of adult midges running around rocks on these warm days. They survive for somewhere between 5 to 10 days, where they mate, lay eggs, and then die. The adults don't even have functional mouth parts. They couldn't eat if they wanted to. They are just there to mate and lay eggs.
Other questions?
Asked a little bit about what they eat. They eat penguin guano, seal offal. They also eat pretty much any of the plant material that we talked about. So the Phrasicola crispa, that terrestrial alga, is a favorite, but we do see them eating many of the species of mosses and the grasses there as well. So they'll eat almost anything that they can kind of shelter in that provides a nice source of carbon.
Do the midges have predators?
Also a great question. No, not really. So they are small enough that I just don't think it's worth it for anything to bother trying to eat them. So none of the seabirds in the area pay any attention to them at all. I mentioned that there are a couple of species of mites in the area. And one of those mites is a predatory mite, but we haven't seen any evidence that those mites are even eating this midge either. We think they're eating another species of mite mostly. So for whatever reason, pretty much everything leaves this insect alone, which then means that just surviving in the super challenging environment is the biggest barrier to their population growing.
Other questions? Okay, one more about your living there. What kind of emergency training do you all have to undergo to be there?
Yeah, so first of all, we talked through the process of getting there. It can take a week from leaving the US to actually get to Palmer Station. And then that ship that took us there will leave Palmer Station after dropping off food and everything, and we'll go back to South America, refuel, pick up more people, that sort of thing, and then come back. And so at some times, depending on where the ship is, the closest like outside help is 1 to 2 weeks away. It would be very difficult to get any outside help. There's no place to land a plane there. Under extreme circumstances, maybe on 2 occasions, they have successfully landed a helicopter on the glacier behind station, but it has enough cracks and crevices that they are really uncomfortable doing that except for dire circumstances. So we go through a pretty intense physical wellness exam before we go, just to make sure that everyone's healthy. I have a friend who was asked to have his wisdom teeth preemptively taken out. He didn't have any issues with his wisdom teeth, but wisdom teeth cause issues enough. They're like, yeah, we'd prefer you got those taken out before you go to Antarctica. So they do go through this pretty strict physical to make sure everyone's healthy. And then from there, we do have a physician on station. So they hire one of the 44 people living at station is a physician with a pretty well-appointed medical clinic. They have antibiotics and an x-ray and everything like that in case something comes up. As far as, just me going down there, I don't have any special training other than like boat safety when I get there. And if we encounter bad weather and get stranded somewhere away from station, how to like put up a tent and stay warm and that sort of thing, but nothing particularly extreme. We do have some of the people who work at the station who are not doing science there, but they're contractors to help keep the station running, who have like fire training and CPR and stuff like that. But it's not especially extreme for this type of place to get to go there.
Surprising. Well, I've got all 4 of my wisdom teeth and I don't plan on parting with them, so that lets me out. So thank you, JD, so much for sharing your experiences there. And I know there's a lot more to share, so we'll have to have you back sometime for another round, another part of this great story.
I would love it. It's been a delight. Thank you so much for inviting me.